Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel. Lost amidst the continuing sagas of the coronavirus, the lockdowns, Michael Flynn, Obamagate, was a story that is absolutely unprecedented in American history. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals found a positive constitutional right to literacy. Now, before going on, let me back up for a second to explain how exactly we got here. In 2016, 7 students filed a lawsuit against the Detroit public school system, claiming that the school system had completely failed in its duty to teach them literacy, because, the lawsuit claimed, the Detroit public schools had been allowed to go to hell in a handbasket. Now, before we say that the kids were just whining or trying to be proto-Greta Thunbergs, let's take a second to remember that the public schools in Detroit are the absolute worst in the United States. To give just one example, in 2018, the Nation's Report Card reported that only 4% of 4th graders in the Detroit public school system were proficient in math, and only 5% were proficient in reading. At the same time, over in the 8th grade, the proficiency rates for math and reading were 5% and 7%, respectively. There are a host of reasons for this, but one of the primary ones is that the Detroit schools, the actual buildings themselves, they are microcosms of how Anton Furst, the set designer for Tim Burton's first Batman movie, described Gotham City. Hell erupted through the pavement. To give just a taste of how bad things are, this is how Lakia Wilson described the Spain Elementary Middle School in Detroit back in 2016, quote, "The gym is closed because half of the floor is buckled and the other half suffered so much rainwater damage from the dripping ceiling that it became covered with toxic black mold. The playground is off limits because a geyser of searing hot steam explodes out of the ground. Exposed wires hang from missing ceiling tiles. Watermarks from leaks abound. Kids either sit in freezing classrooms with their coats on or strip off layers because of stifling heat." Add to that the infestation of rodents and insects, the lack of textbooks and desks, and the fact that some classrooms have no teachers, and you have an environment that would fit very nicely with the interior of Gotham City. The lawsuit filed by the students, Gary B. versus Snyder, argued that because of these conditions, the students in the Detroit public school system were being denied their right to be taught how to read and how to write. In 2018, a district court actually threw out the case, saying that even though, yes, conditions in the school were quote-unquote devastating, no one's rights were being violated. But the case was appealed, and in a 2-1 decision, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that decision and, for the very first time in U.S. history, said that there was a positive constitutional right to literacy. Gary B. versus Snyder isn't even the only case like this. Over in Rhode Island, Cook versus Ramonda is making an even broader argument that there is in fact a positive constitutional right to education in general. Now, what's really clever about this case is that it hangs its hat on Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, the part that promises each state a Republican government. The argument goes that since Rhode Island doesn't require a civics curriculum or an American history curriculum, like a lot of states honestly, students in Rhode Island are not being educated in these areas. This means ultimately that the state is denying these students their other constitutionally protected rights, like the right to freely assemble or the right to vote, since these rights, and their other rights, rely at the very least on a basic understanding of civics and American education. I would go a step farther and say that the rights also depend on the ability to actually think and to argue, but that's just me. What's more, since 1 in 10 schools in Rhode Island now are majority Hispanic, the Hispanic population of the state having tripled since 1990, the argument continues that the burden of all this is falling disproportionately on these Hispanic majority schools, which is a clear violation of the 14th Amendment. In fact, quick little side note here, the Providence Public School District was taken behind the woodshed in 2018 by none other than the Justice Department on account of how it was teaching its English as a second language students. The DOJ revealed that the PSD had, amongst other things, shoved English learners into hundreds of schools that had no English language services, used unsound English learning programs, had failed to adequately implement English learning programs, and then had failed to actually staff those programs with qualified teachers, and didn't even bother evaluating English language programs for their effectiveness. Several people on the right, however, have rallied against this idea that there is a positive constitutional right to education or literacy, basically saying that it's moonshine. Over at The Federalist, for example, Michael Donnelly wrote that one of the primary problems with the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals decision is that it relies on a judicial theory called substantive due process, which was a judicial theory that was birthed from opinions about the 14th Amendment, what it actually means, and what all that it covers. Donnelly points out that substantive due process has become nothing more than a judicial veto, allowing judges anywhere to strike down state laws and decisions that they don't like. Roe v. Wade and the Obergefell decision back in 2015 were both examples of this. So right off the bat, this decision is illegitimate because it's just another example of a judge putting what he personally wants to be in the Constitution into the Constitution. Donnelly goes further. If there is found to be an actual positive constitutional right to education, that means that the federal government will be in complete control of education. Right now, as it stands, the federal government can only control education through high-end bribery, creating programs that offer states a whole lot of money if they implement certain requirements and fulfill certain goals that the federal government wants them to. A federal right to education would mean that the feds can ditch the bribery and just go to full-out control. This could lead to a National Curriculum Act, a National Testing Act, a National Compulsory Attendance Act. And at a time when elitists and ideologues have made no bones that they want to clean their claws on homeschooling, the results of those acts would be disastrous. There is also the argument from the libertarian Mises Institute, which says that education isn't a right, but an economic good. And so like all other economic goods, if you want it, little buddy, it's up to you to go out and get it. Nobody owes you a car, nobody owes you a house, nobody owes you a job, and nobody owes you education. On the other hand, the arguments laid out in Cook and Gary B are actually really convincing. Our rights, like assembly, free speech, freedom of religion, voting, all require an educated population which will be able to exercise those rights responsibly. Republican self-government itself requires an educated population, a fact that the Founding Fathers preached about numerous times, and which we actually went over just a few weeks ago. And our country is doing a horrible job at educating us. This past week, Reason's Corey DeAngelis pointed out on Twitter that the new numbers from the Nation's report card are just out, and yeah, they're not good. To cite just 3 examples, 24% proficiency in civics, 35% proficiency in geography, and 15% proficiency in American history. What makes this all worse is that the U.S. spends more per pupil per year than practically any other country. In May 2019, the Census Bureau released a report which said, quote, "The amount spent per pupil for public elementary and secondary education, pre-kindergarten through 12th grade, for all 50 states and the District of Columbia increased by 3.7% to $12,201 per pupil during the 2017 fiscal year, compared to $11,763 per pupil in 2016, according to new tables released today by the U.S. Census Bureau." Oh, and by the way, this was the 5th consecutive year that per pupil per year spending had increased. Contrariwise, countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, countries that include Canada, Australia, the UK, Israel, Ireland, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, they on average spend $9,500 per pupil per year, often with better results than what we get here in the US. So what is education? Privilege or a right? But before we answer that question, if you're enjoying the video, take a second to subscribe and to ring the bell for notifications so that you will be alerted each week when I post new videos about the culture, politics, and religion from a unique POV. The big fundamental problem is that we have forgotten what education is even for. More often than not now, education is presented kind of like this. Okay, son, you need to study really hard so that you can pass all your tests so that you can graduate to the next grade. So that at the end of 12 years, you can get a high school diploma, which will be your key to getting into a good college. so that you can repeat the process 8 more times, at the end of which you can graduate with a college diploma, which will be your ticket, in theory, to a job and a career. It's the good life. Now, nothing against jobs, employment, or careers, all of which are very necessary. But neither are they the end-all and be-all of education. Man does not live on bread alone, after all, nor does he just subsist on his rights. When you get right down to it, the purpose of education is to make us more human. The 20th century philosopher Jacques Maritain said that of all the other things in the world, man is unique in that he is the one who actually has to work to attain his essence. Now, that doesn't mean that some people are more equal than others because some people are more human than others. No, that's not what Maritain is saying at all. What Maritain is saying is that we, unlike all the other animals in the world, can actually become more fully what we are, more fully human. And we can do this because we are rational animals. The more knowledge we have, the more wisdom we accumulate, the more we will be able to actually ask fundamental questions like, what is justice? What is piety? What is the good life? Why are we even here on this earth? In other words, we will be able to examine our life and life in general, which, as Socrates pointed out, is the only thing, when we get right down to it, that makes life worth living. And the more that we actually examine life, the more we will be able to determine what is true and what is good. But if the end goal of education is to bring our humanity into full bloom by discovering the true and the good, then education can't just be some utilitarian process that prepares us to enter the workforce like another drone. Nor is it just about teaching us what it means to be a good citizen so that we can use our rights responsibly. Education is about allowing ourselves to genuinely flourish as human persons. This means that education has to include things like history, theology, literature, philosophy, languages, the natural sciences. But it also means that we can't just be learning lists of facts and syllogisms. Facts and syllogisms are absolutely fine, and I love them. But at the end of the day, education has to be about teaching us how to think, how to critically use what we've got up here. One great example of this principle in action is the Bard Prison Initiative Program. Started in 1999, it actually gives prisoners a classical education, where they learn classical Greek literature, Shakespeare, history, Chinese, and attend writing seminars. All taught by professors who hold their students in prison to the same standards that they would any other college student. As the Washington Examiner reported last December, quote, Bard Prison Initiative students grapple with texts and are drawn into stories that speak of the age-old struggles of the human condition. What does it mean to live a good life? What is justice? Why does power corrupt? No one ever taught me any of that, said student Giovanni. Now, having said all that, we can finally answer the question, is education a privilege or is it a right? And the answer is yes and no. If I have an absolute right to something, it means that someone out there in the wide, wide world has a positive corresponding duty to give me the thing that I have a right to. So, to put it into this context, if I have a positive right to education, it means that someone out there has a positive moral duty to give me an education. But education can't work like that because, as we just said, education is about human flourishing. And at the end of the day, the only people who are responsible for our own personal flourishing is the guy who stares back at us in the mirror.
The training is nothing. The will is everything. The will to act.
Jumping from that clip as an example, let's look at one of the greatest characters ever created, the Batman. You don't have to have watched the movies, the shows, or read the comic books to know that Batman is pretty much the archetype of human perfection, not just physically, but mentally. Fluent in over a dozen languages, an expert across multiple fields, and a master of 120 different fighting styles. But Bruce didn't become a master in any of these fields, sitting around Wayne Manor after his parents were gunned down in Crime Alley because he was waiting for someone to come to him to train him how to become the world's greatest detective. He took the responsibility upon himself and traveled around the world, seeking the best experts in everything he wanted to become a master in, and asked them to train him. Or if that's a little too fantastic and comic booky for your tastes, then look at people like Ben Carson or Clarence Thomas. Both of them grew up in textbook environments of poverty, and anyone looking at them when they were kids in those environments would never guess that one of them would become a Supreme Court justice and the other one would become a renowned brain surgeon and later the Secretary of Housing. They both achieved those goals because they both were inspired to become more than what their circumstances seemed to dictate. And then they worked hard to actually make those visions a reality. On the other hand, education isn't just some pull yourself up by the bootstraps sort of deal either. Jose Nino, the man who argued for the Mises Institute that education wasn't a right, said, "Interventionists and politicians use abstractions such as society to justify the forceful confiscation of resources from one group of people to another group of people. But society isn't an abstraction. It's all of us working together for the common good to preserve our heritage and our civilization. As such, society does have responsibilities that it is morally obligated to justly discharge to each of its members." While no one has a positive right to education, society does have what we could call a civilizational responsibility, that all of us live in an environment that encourages us to reach our full potential as human persons, something that, as we've seen, includes education. Now, what would this look like? It would include expanding school choice and school vouchers, loosening the laws against homeschooling, and probably even promoting the idea of local communities and private organizations teaming up to help families in real dire need with the financial end of educating their children. It would also mean that society promote family and marriage, since those two things are strong indicators of how children will actually do in school, recognizing the genuinely true and the genuinely good, as well as the fact that the individual is a full human person and not just a drone for the workforce. Education is so important for our lives that we can't just hand it over to the federal bureaucracy because we've decided that it's a positive right. But on the other hand, it's so important that we can't just look at, say, kids in Detroit and shrug our shoulders and say, well, sorry guys, tough toenails, ta-ta! There's a balance that has to be achieved. And until that happens, children, not just in Detroit, but all over the country, are going to be suffering the consequences. But as always, what say you? Is education a right, or is it an economic good? And what's the reason for your answer? As always, let me know your thoughts, ideas in the comment box below. Well, that about wraps up everything for this week, gang. Before you go, if you could show your support by giving the video a like and sharing it with your friends on social media, that would be swell. Thanks for watching, for giving me a little bit of your day. And until next week, gang, remember to dare to read, think, speak, and write. I'll see you all next time. Ciao.